In case you missed last week's video, I got the posts and girders built for this huge porch project I'm working on, and in this week's video I'm going to finish up the rest of the framing work. To get started, I needed to attach the ledger board to the building, but first I had to cut away a section of the metal siding along where the ledger board would be located. I figured out the exact height of my cut in SketchUp, making sure to account for the thickness of the 2x4 purlins and metal roofing I'll be using, and I added another 3/4 of an inch to my number to give me plenty of wiggle room. Once I had my number, I measured out the location on the building using the same area where I measured for the post height previously, and then set up my rotary laser and grade rod to match that new measurement. Next, I made a few marks along the building, even with the height of the grade rod, and then we could snap a chalk line between those measurements. For whatever reason, the chalk line didn't work great here, I think because the siding was a little wavy, so I had to come back and redraw the marks with a level and Sharpie before getting started cutting. To make the cuts, I used an angle grinder with a 6-inch cutoff wheel, and I was honestly kind of dreading this. Thankfully, this flex volt angle grinder ripped through this siding, and it was surprisingly simple to connect my cuts between my marks and keep the cut running level. After cutting one panel, I went ahead and removed the offcut, and thankfully, things were looking good with the framing behind the panel, and my measurements matched up with my SketchUp model. I also went ahead and added a self-tapping screw at each stud, about 7 inches up from my cut line, and this just kept the siding panels in place as I worked and left me room to tuck flashing up under the siding later. Before continuing cutting, I also donned my welding jacket, welding gloves, and face mask to protect me from the shower of sparks. From there, it was really just rinse and repeat, and I cut as much of the siding as I could reach before having to move my walkboard. The last thing I did in this section was to make a vertical cut along where the ledger board would end, and I found this location by using a laser line to transfer my markup from the screw I'd used for my string line when setting the posts earlier. After finishing this first section, we moved the walkboard down the building, and then I continued cutting away metal siding, unearthing lots of old hornet's nests, spider webs, rat poop, and other treasures along the way. Unsurprisingly, there was no sealant along the bottom edge of this siding, meaning bugs have had free reign over this area for the last 50 years, and I definitely plan to rectify that, starting in the area above this porch roof by adding some foam closure strips when I install the flashing for the porch roof later. And as I worked outside, Nate worked inside, getting some blocking added between the studs to give us a spot to attach the siding panels and flashing more securely later on. With that done, I could get the ledger board installed, but first I marked where the ledger would end on the band board, again using a laser line to transfer this mark up from lower on the building. Next, I measured out the location of the top edge of the ledger board, which was about 4 inches below where I cut the steel, and got my reader set on my grade rod. I again made a few marks along the building so we could snap a line, but some of this old rotten trim was getting in the way of the grade rod, so I also went ahead and started demoing some of the trim since I'm going to be replacing it. With the ledger board location marked out, it was easy to get the pieces attached to the building, and we initially just tacked them in place with 3-inch screws before coming back and adding a few lag screws. I didn't add all of the lag screws initially though, as I didn't want them interfering with the rafter locations, so we were really just getting the ledger board located here. We continued on down the rest of the building and got all of the ledger board pieces mounted before calling it a day. I got started the next day by marking layout on the ledger board, and I once again pulled these numbers from my SketchUp model. I used a 2-foot on center spacing for the rafters and marked both sides so I could easily see where I needed to mount the rafter regardless of where I was standing. Once that was done, I came back and added the rest of my lag screws to permanently attach the ledger board to the building. I used these 4-inch GRK RSS screws, which are designed to replace through bolts for mounting ledger boards, and I followed their guidelines to determine my lag screw layout, adding them roughly every 16 inches. Finally, I took a few measurements between the ledger board and girders, measuring from the front of the girder to the front face of the ledger board, and then I could get to cutting the rafters. I designed this porch so I could just cut these 16-foot yellowwood 2x6s in half for the rafters, and I went ahead and cut the 7-degree angle when making this cut to match my 1.5 to 12 roof pitch. Next, I marked out the distance from the angled end of the board to the heel of the bird's mouth, which I had measured for already, and then I could lay out my bird's mouth. To do this, I first grabbed my 12-inch speed square and set it on my mark. Next, I turned the speed square so the 7-degree common angle mark was aligned with the edge of my board, and again 7 degrees was the angle to match my roof bench. Next, I measured the depth of my heel cut, which is kind of arbitrary, but I had modeled it at 1.25 inches in SketchUp, so that's what I went with. Just know that it can't be more than 25% of the depth of the rafter by code. Finally, I squared up my speed square with my 7-degree line and the depth mark and drew the last line to mark my seat cut. From there, all that was left to do was to cut the bird's mouth, and I used a circular saw to make the bulk of the cut since it's pretty easy to get a straight square cut. I finished the cut with a jigsaw, which only needed to remove a small sliver left by the circular saw in this case. With that, the bird's mouth was cut so I could head outside to test the fit. I tacked the rafter in place with a screw and the fit looked good, although the filler board I had added at the end of the girder was a little proud of the other 2 girder plies, and it was pushing the rafter up. I removed the rafter and pulled out my electric hand plane to bring the board flush, and this was a little bit tricky up on the ladder. I got it done, but not before gouging the end of the girder slightly, which was definitely frustrating. I checked the fit again and it was looking much better, so I went ahead and marked my layout on the girder. I also measured and marked the length of each rafter, and these measurements were highly variable since this building is far from straight after settling and shifting over the last 50 years. With those measurements in hand, I could start batching out rafters using the first rafter as a template. To do this, I'd first mark the measurement I took, which I had written down on a numbered list on my phone. Next, I aligned the bird's mouth of my template rafter with this mark and traced the bird's mouth onto the new rafter. With the bird's mouth marked, I removed the template, clamped the new board down, and cut the bird's mouth. Finally, I numbered the top edge of the new rafter and set it aside to cut the next rafter. I repeated the same process to get a few more rafters cut and then headed outside to get them installed. To install the rafters, I initially toe screwed them in place, lining up the rafter with my layout lines and flushing the bottom edge with the ledger board. I only added a few screws to hold the boards in place initially, but came back and toe nailed the rafters with 2 to 3 nails on each side with my framing nailer later on. And once the first few rafters were up, I got into a groove, measuring the next handful of rafters, heading inside to cut them, and then coming back out to install them. While I'm working, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Yellowwood. So I was lucky enough to work with the folks at Yellowwood on this project, and I was super impressed by the quality of the lumber. For this porch project, I used Yellowwood 6x6s for the post, 2x12s for the girders, and their KDAT 2x6s for the rafters, and 2x4s for the purlins. KDAT, or kiln dried after treatment, boards are dried to their original moisture content in an oven, which minimizes the shrinking, cupping, or warping you might see with freshly treated lumber. This also means the boards are lighter and they can be painted or stained immediately. This KDAT material really was a pleasure to work with, and I'd highly recommend it for your next outdoor project. Yellowwood preserved wood products are protected against rot, fungal decay, and termite attack, so I know this porch will stand the test of time. Yellowwood is also affordable, especially for the value it offers. The wood itself has a light, natural color that I think is beautiful, but it can also easily be stained or painted, and I'll be staining my boards using Yellowwood Protector. Anytime I'm doing an outdoor project, I reach for Yellowwood brand products, and I really trust them for long-term protection and durability. If you're looking for project ideas, you can download a free DIY project plan at yellowwood.com, and thanks again to Yellowwood for sponsoring this week's video. I wrapped up day 3 of the roof build by getting all of the rafters, aside from the fly rafters, installed, and overall the porch was really starting to take shape. The following day, we got started by removing the diagonal bracing to get it out of our way, and then we could get the rafter tails cut to final length. I had left the tails long so we could trim them later, and this just makes installation go a lot faster. I started by figuring out how long I wanted the rafter tails, which was about 22 inches in this case, and then I marked a plumb line to represent where I needed to make my cut. I did this at both ends of the roof, and then we could snap a line between the 2 marks. And since this roof is so long, I had to snap the line at a few different points. Next, I could mark my cut line on each rafter, and I whipped up a quick jig for this. And this made marking the line go really quick, and this was yet another tip I picked up from my buddy Eric Perkins. With the lines marked, all that was left to do was cut the tails to length, and I used a circular saw for this. And this was surprisingly easy, especially with the walkboard set up so I could see my line easily. Once I had enough rafters cut down, we could get our first piece of fascia board installed while we had our walkboard set up. To help support the board, we screwed a scrap to the underside of a rafter at one end, and you'll also notice that we ran the fascia past the last rafter by 9.5 inches, since there will be one more fly rafter added later. I got the fascia screwed to the rafter at one end, breaking it on the middle of the rafter, and I used my speed square to line up the top edge of the rafter with the top edge of the fascia. As I went down attaching the fascia, Nate could raise or lower his end of the board to help line everything up, and it is so much easier doing this with 2 people. Once the fascia was attached to each rafter, we could come back and add the fly rafter. Unfortunately, I screwed up my cut here and cut the angle on one end in the wrong direction, so I had to recut this rafter first. Thankfully, I'd ordered extra material, and once I had the new rafter cut, we got it installed. Also, we didn't add any ladder blocking or outriggers here, as you might typically do for this kind of fly rafter, as the purlins will help to support this rafter once they're installed. From there, we just repeated the process down the rest of the roof, cutting the rafter tails to length and installing the fascia boards. And unfortunately, my camera died just before we attached the last fly rafter, but here's the finished rafters. The last bits of framing to add to the roof were the purlins, which run perpendicular to the rafters, and the metal roofing panels will be attached to these purlins, and we ran a row along the entire roof at a 2-foot on center spacing. The first row was aligned with the front of the fascia, again using my speed square, and I used 3-inch hot-dipped galvanized framing nails to attach the purlins since this is treated material. Rather than snapping lines for the following rows, I whipped up a pair of spacer blocks to set the spacing between the rows of purlins. I think this was a lot simpler, and since we only had 5 rows of purlins, there wasn't a ton of room for compounding error in case the spacers were slightly off. From there, Nate worked on installing the rest of the purlins, and I got to work on the last pieces of framing on the porch, the knee braces. I cut these from 4x4s and cut them at 4 feet long from long point to long point, and this meant I could get 2 knee braces out of an 8-foot long 4x4. After cutting the knee braces to length, I cut an opposing 45-degree angle at the end of the pieces to clip off the sharp corner. And this is kind of a subtle decorative touch, and I think it looks nicer and makes the board a little less fragile. Next, I needed to drill the holes for the 6-inch lag screws I'd be using to attach the knee braces, and I wanted to lay these out so they both looked nice but also didn't end up too close to the edge of the knee brace. I laid out my hole locations on all the pieces using an awl to mark the hole location to give my bit a reference point, and then I could move to the drill press to drill the holes. I started by countersinking the holes with a 1-inch Forstner bit, and this will allow the head of the lag screw to sit below the face of the knee brace. After countersinking, I drilled a through hole with a 3/8-inch twist bit, and it's important to drill the holes in this order as the Forstner bit won't have a center point to reference if you drill the through holes first. Finally, because I'm a woodworker at heart and love a good chamfer, I went ahead and chamfered the edges of the countersunk holes with this big countersink drill bit, and I think this was a really nice touch. With that done, we could finally install the knee braces, and unfortunately, we immediately ran into a problem. Somehow I overlooked the fact that my hole locations would cause the lag screws to protrude through the top of the knee brace, so they'd be visible, which was obviously not a good look. Thankfully, this was a pretty easy fix, and I just cut about 1 inch off of each end of the boards, which brought the holes in line with the angled cut. After making the fix, we got the first knee brace positioned using the 45-degree bubble on this torpedo level to get the knee brace level. Once the brace was level, we tacked it in place with a 3-inch screw at each end, making sure it was flush with the face of the post and girder. Next, I used a long 1/4-inch drill bit to pre-drill the holes into the post and girder, and then I could finally drive in the lag screws with an impact driver. From there, we just repeated the process on the rest of the knee braces. Also, instead of just leveling the braces where 2 of them met up on one post, I used a speed square to mark a line even with the other brace and align them that way, since I figured that was probably more important visually. We got the last knee brace installed, and they were looking great, plus they really stiffened up the porch laterally. The last thing to do to wrap up the framing was to install the hurricane ties, and these help to secure the rafters to the girders and are required by code. We installed the hurricane ties with a positive placement nailer, using 2.5-inch nails to attach the tie to the girder and 1.5-inch nails to attach it to the rafters. And this nailer really sped things up, and considering there were 10 nails needed on each hurricane tie on 28 of these rafters, I was really glad to not have to be hand driving all these nails. Nate finished installing the rest of the hurricane ties, and with that, we could officially call the porch framing done. Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you don't want to miss next week's video on getting the metal roof installed and wrapping up this whole front porch project, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell. Also have links to all the tools and materials, including all of those Yellowwood products I use down in the video description below. And last, if you want to support me, I sell merch, I have Patreon and YouTube membership set up, and I have plans available on my website. Alright, thanks for watching y'all, and until next week, happy building.